Out past Dry Willow, where fences lean with memory and wind smooths over old pain, a rancher rode out looking for a horse, just a steady mare, nothing more. But what he found in that quiet barn wasn't stock. It was a woman, curled in straw, silent as loss, and the kind of hurt that doesn't cry out loud. The West don't much speak of stories like this. Stories that stay hidden in the corners of stalls, in the eyes that flinch from light. But some truths don't shout. They settle in slowly, like dust. And once they do, they don't leave easily. If these old Western stories feel like a fire worth keeping, share the warmth. Leave a like and subscribe so the trail never runs cold. Part 1. A dry spring and a man looking for a horse. The spring came dry, the kind that fooled you into hoping for rain with every shift of wind, only to give you grit between your teeth and dust behind your eyes. Out past Dry Willow, the grass had cracked into lines like old skin, and even the creek had stopped pretending to run. Folks didn't talk about it, just cinched their belts tighter, patched the roof one more time, and prayed, without looking like they were praying. Clay Harlan rode with his hat pulled low and his coat flapping at the edges like it didn't belong to him. He wasn't a man given to much speech. Folks in town said he'd once had a wife who laughed like creek water and could rope a calf faster than he could saddle. She'd gone quiet after the stillbirth of their only child, and one morning so had she. No suicide, no drama. Just gone. Left her boots by the porch door swinging wide in the wind. Clay never replaced them. That was 8 winters ago. He didn't come to Nelson's ranch for memories or talk. He came for a horse, something sturdy, something that didn't need coaxing or a pedigree. His gelding had turned up lame last week, and Clay had work piling like thunder. Nelson's place was 15 miles over the ridge, tucked into a fold of land that never quite shook its reputation for bad luck. But horses were hard to come by this season, and Clay was the kind of man who'd rather wear holes in his boots than ask twice. The trail in was rutted and dry, the mesquite reaching out like crooked fingers. The sun hung just high enough to cook the dust, and vultures circled slow above the far edge of the draw. Clay didn't take it as a sign, just life in the West. Nelson met him near the barn, wiping sweat with the kind of handkerchief that never saw water. "Ain't much to look at," he said, thumbing toward the paddock, "but that mare'll get you where you need." Clay nodded, his way of saying he'd look. The barn leaned like a man with one bad hip, gray boards weather-beaten, the big sliding door sticking halfway open. Inside, the smell hit first, old hay, sweat, something slightly off. Not rot, but not right either. A few chickens scratched in a corner, and flies buzzed the way they do when no one's cared enough to shoo them. The mare was there, roan with a nicked ear and good legs. Clay moved quiet, boots scuffing just enough to let the animal know he wasn't hunting. His eyes scanned the tack, the rails, the way dust settled in corners like secrets. He stepped closer to the far stall, the one with the door half-hinged and no rope on the latch. The mare shifted, but Clay's attention had already gone elsewhere. There, in the far back, where light barely touched, something moved, barely more than a breath through straw. He paused. Most would have missed it, a shadow behind a shadow. But Clay had learned the stillness of grief, had lived in rooms where breath made no sound and pain knew better than to cry out loud. He stepped forward. At first all he saw was shape, curled tight like someone afraid to stretch out. Then the shape became limbs, and the limbs belonged to a woman, young, maybe mid-20s, with hair the color of riverbank silt and skin that hadn't seen daylight in some time. Her dress was the kind that used to be blue. Now it was more dirt than fabric. Her hands were tucked under her knees, her back against the splintered wood, and her eyes, dark and wide, watched him without blinking. She didn't move, didn't beg, didn't even shift when the mare snorted behind Clay. Her face was thin, but not hollow, her mouth tight, not trembling. She wasn't hiding like someone afraid, more like someone who had no place else to be. Clay didn't speak, not because he was afraid to, but because words felt too loud in that moment. She looked like something left behind, not discarded, not broken, just forgotten. And somehow that was worse. He stood there longer than he meant to. A wind creaked the barn siding, rattled a loose plank above, and somewhere outside, Nelson's dog barked at something long gone. The woman didn't react. Clay tipped his hat slightly, a gesture not quite greeting, not quite farewell. Then he stepped back, boots silent on straw, and walked out of the barn. Part 2. A rustling breath in a forgotten stall. The barn had that old, tired quiet that came from too many seasons passed without repair. It leaned a little to the left, like it was done holding up the weight of men's plans. Clay Harlan stepped through its wide, groaning doors and paused, letting the dry smell of hay dust, rotted wood, and manure settle into his lungs. Light cut through knotholes overhead, casting thin beams across the dirt floor like broken prayers from a sky that hadn't offered rain in months. The mare he came to see stood in the back stall, a dapple gray with tired hips and calm eyes. She shifted when he approached but didn't spook. Clay rubbed her withers, ran a hand down her leg, testing the joints. She'd do. Nothing special, but sure-footed. That's all he ever asked of anything these days. He was turning to call for old man Nelson when something pulled at the edge of his vision. A flicker, a shape, some quiet kind of presence tucked into the shadows along the far wall. It wasn't a horse. Wasn't an animal at all. It was a girl. No, not a girl, a woman, thin as fence wire and still as fence post. She was curled up on her side in the straw, hidden behind a low beam and a stack of cracked tack boxes. If she'd meant to stay unseen, she'd done a good job of it. Only the slow shift of her shoulder as she breathed gave her away. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, face tucked down beneath a tangle of black hair and old flannel. Her boots were worn to the sole, tied with strips of rag. She looked like she hadn't slept right in a year. Clay didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, one hand still resting on the mare's neck, trying to make sense of the image in front of him. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. She didn't shrink when she saw him. She didn't scream. Her eyes found his and held them, wide and sharp and waiting, not pleading, not angry, just braced, like she already knew what kind of man he might be and was readying herself for it. Her face was too hollow to guess her age, somewhere between youth and worn-down womanhood. Dust clung to her skin like it had settled there to stay. And yet, she wasn't filthy, not neglected. There was still something in her posture that said she was trying to keep what little of herself remained. Clay shifted his weight. The mare stirred. He broke eye contact first and walked toward the barn doors. He didn't want to be looking at her. He didn't want to be seeing what he'd just seen. Outside, the sun slapped him across the brow with that hard, dry heat the plains were famous for. Nelson was by the well, working the pump with one arm and a slouch. His face looked like leather left too long in the sun, and his hat was stained near black with sweat. "She one of your ranch hands?" Clay asked, keeping his voice even. Nelson barely turned. "Huh?" "The woman in the barn." There was a long pause before Nelson spat into the dust. "She's working off debt," he muttered. "Brought in by her kin a while back. Said she'd eat less than the old man owed. I kept her. Ain't much more to say." "She got papers." Nelson looked up at him now, one eyebrow raised. "Papers? Hell, she ain't got nothing but that flannel and a bad attitude. She tries to run. She'll find herself in a worse place than my barn. I promise you that. County law don't look kindly on vagrants." Clay didn't say anything, just rubbed the back of his neck. his fingers coming away dusty. He wasn't looking for trouble, hadn't been in a fight since his wife died, didn't want to start something he couldn't finish. But that girl's eyes. Back in the saddle, he rode home slower than usual. Let the horse pick its pace through the low gullies and mesquite brush. His thoughts stayed in that barn, with the way her body barely moved, like each breath was a question she wasn't sure deserved answering. He'd seen that kind of quiet before. It lived in folks after floods, after fires. He remembered it from the war, and once, in the mirror. That night, Clay poured himself coffee and sat on the porch, long past dusk. Coyotes barked somewhere beyond the ridgeline. The stars were too many to count. He'd bought a mare, and that should have been that. But the barn hadn't let go of him yet. Part 3. No papers, nowhere to go. Next morning, Clay was back in the saddle before the sun fully rose, a half loaf of cornbread wrapped in muslin tucked into his saddlebag beside a tin of well water. He didn't tell himself why he rode back to Nelson's place. Didn't explain it, not even in the quiet of his own mind. Some things didn't need explaining. Some things just needed doing. The mare he'd bought was standing tied outside the barn, chewing at a rope knot like she meant to undo her own troubles. Nelson wasn't around, probably off in town or half drunk behind the bunkhouse. Clay led his horse into the barn slowly, letting the light adjust around him, boots scuffing soft against packed dirt. She was still there. Same corner. Same tangle of limbs folded in on herself, like she was trying to take up less space in the world. But her eyes were open. They tracked him the whole way in. He didn't speak, just knelt down without getting too close, set the cornbread and water gently near a coil of rope she could reach, if she wanted. Then he leaned back against a beam, let out a quiet breath, and looked out over the stall dividers like a man inspecting timber grain. No one said a word. The girl didn't move for a long time, not until he turned to go. That's when she reached, slow, like each joint was testing its own permission, and pulled the muslin bundle into her lap. She didn't unwrap it, just held it there, like the gesture itself meant more than what was inside. Clay touched the brim of his hat and stepped back into the sun. It wasn't much of a life he lived, but it was steady. The cabin sat pressed up against a slope of wind-blown hill, with fence lines that bowed from time and sun. He had a few head of cattle, a dog that slept more than barked, and a field that grew just enough hay to be called one. No family, no letters coming in, no firewood he didn't cut himself. That night, Clay sat at his table with a plate of beans and bacon and thought about the barn, about the way she hadn't flinched, hadn't spoken, hadn't begged. That part stayed with him most. No reaching, no asking, just a silence that had learned how to survive. He reached into the drawer beside the hearth and pulled out an old slip of folded paper, his wife's last note tucked there 10 years ago. The ink was faded now, so was the anger, but the absence that still had weight. The next day he rode back again, this time with a wool blanket. Nelson caught him on the way out. "You forget something again, Harlan." Clay didn't break stride. "Said I might come for the saddle. Needs new rigging." Nelson laughed, dry as sand. "You're wearing your own saddle, boy." Clay mounted up. "Then maybe I'm just checking on your stock." He rode out without waiting for the man to answer. The days rolled on like that, always some excuse. A loose bridle to return. A jug of milk he claimed he'd left. Salt licks for calves Nelson didn't even own. Each visit, Clay left something small behind in the shadows of that barn. A tin cup, a strip of jerky, a cracked bar of lye soap. Never asked her name. Never asked her story. But he always looked at her just long enough to know she was still there. And she never moved until he was gone. About a week in, Clay sat outside the sheriff's office, legs heavy with dust, eyes narrowed at the county notices tacked to the frame. One in particular caught his attention. Unregistered individuals found laboring without documentation or sponsor subject to detainment and state reassignment, applicable to all citizens, age 12 and up. Signed, Deputy Cole, Dry Willow Post. The wording sat like a lump in his throat. He pushed through the swinging doors. Sheriff Bowman wasn't in, but the deputy was. A young man with too much badge and not enough boots. "You registering someone?" the deputy asked, barely looking up from his desk. "Might be," Clay said. "What's it cost to sponsor a worker who ain't got papers?" The deputy sat up, now giving him a long look. "Depends who's asking." Clay reached into his coat and pulled out his cattle brand registration, set it down slow. "Harlan, I've got land enough and a name that still means something." The boy glanced down, then nodded. "You'd need to sign county papers, say you'll be responsible for her well-being, housing, food, behavior, you sure?" Clay didn't answer. He took the papers, signed them by hand, folded them once, twice, then tucked them into his breast pocket like a quiet kind of promise. Then he left. Didn't tell a soul, didn't have to. The wind carried that kind of thing out here. Always did. Part 4. The Look That Doesn't Lift. The road back to Nelson's place ran through a dry arroyo just wide enough to trap the morning chill. The wind hadn't let up, and the dust had a way of settling into a man's clothes like regret. Clay rode without hurry, the paper folded in his coat pocket pressing soft against his chest. He didn't know what he was expecting when he got there. Maybe he wasn't expecting anything at all. Maybe that was the whole reason he kept coming back. The barn looked the same as always, weathered and gray, slumped into itself like it knew it was carrying too much history in its beams. Clay led his mare in, let the smell of sun-baked timber and old hay settle over him. She was still in the corner. Same position, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around herself like rope. Her hair looked less wild today. Someone, maybe her, maybe not, had pulled it back behind her ears. The blanket he'd left was pulled around her shoulders like armor, and her eyes were open. He didn't say anything, didn't move toward her either, just took off his hat, wiped the dust from the brim, and sat down slow on an upturned feed bucket across the stall from her. Between them lay the dirt, the leftover scraps of another life, and silence as thick as anything spoken. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, but her eyes followed every motion, alert, wary, not afraid exactly, but not softened either. Clay had seen that look before, in the mirror mostly, in the quiet mornings after his wife passed, when even coffee couldn't wash the emptiness out of a room. It wasn't a look of hunger. It was a look of someone who had learned not to expect anything. Someone whose world had become so narrow, it didn't allow for things like kindness without suspicion. He reached into his coat, slow, pulled out the folded county form, didn't unfold it, just held it in his hand like a man holding fire, warming but too hot to press close just yet. He looked over at her. "This don't mean anything yet," he said. His voice was low, like wind talking to itself through fence wire. "Just means I'm willing to make sure nobody drags you out of here like you're a mule that broke fence." Still, she said nothing, but her fingers shifted slightly under the blanket, a small twitch barely there. He didn't press. Instead, he set the form down near the edge of her stall, not close enough to be threatening, not far enough to be forgotten. Next, he took a small tin of water from his bag and a slice of dried peach he'd packed from last year's canning, set them both down beside the paper. Then he stood. "You don't owe me," he said plainly, "and I ain't here to fix you. Just figured someone ought to act like you're still a person." He tipped his hat and left the barn. Didn't look back. Didn't need to. That night, Clay sat on the edge of his porch, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He watched the wind tumble dry weeds across the empty yard. His dog, Bristle, lay at his boots, twitching occasionally in some half-remembered dream. He'd been alone long enough that silence had become familiar company. But the silence tonight was different. Not heavier, not darker, just more aware. Like something in him had stirred and didn't quite know what to do with itself yet. Inside, the form he'd taken from the sheriff's office sat on the table, unfolded now. His signature scrawled firm at the bottom. Her name, if she had one, still blank. He didn't know what she'd do with it, didn't expect her to do anything. But it was there now. That mattered. It meant something had changed, even if only in the quiet space between two people who hadn't yet spoken a single word to each other. The next day, he rode out again. Not to Nelson's barn this time. To the hills past Red Hollow, where spring runoff left puddles shallow enough to catch minnows. He stopped by an old creek bed where sage grew thick and bees moved lazy in the sun. There he cut a small bundle of rabbit brush and wild mint, wrapped them in a handkerchief, tied it with an old bootlace. It wasn't much, but it smelled like open fields and something alive. Back at the barn, she was there. Same place, though she'd moved slightly. Her back was no longer pressed to the wall, and the blanket was tucked tight around her shoulders. He didn't speak, just set the bundle down where the others had been. She looked at it, then at him. Their eyes met, just for a second. And for the first time, she blinked. It was nothing, and it was everything. Part 5. The man who never bought anything but silence saw. The saddle he claimed to forget wasn't even his. It belonged to a neighbor 3 pastures over, and it hadn't held a horse since before the last drought. But Clay Harlan walked into Nelson's barn the next morning like he had urgent business and too little time. He didn't look at the stall right away, just ran his fingers along the saddle tree, muttered something about dry leather and cracked cinches. Then, as if remembering, he reached into his saddlebag and drew out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Cornbread, still warm from the pan. Next came a wool blanket, old but thick, with a stitched patch shaped like a crooked star. He didn't say a word as he placed both just outside the shadow line where she crouched. Didn't wait for her to take them, didn't ask for thanks. Just left them, nodded once to the barn as if it were listening, and walked back into the wind. That became a rhythm. Every day, another excuse. A broken bridle, a calf that wandered too far east. One morning he brought a coil of fencing wire and stood under the cottonwood tree near the creek for a good 10 minutes, just staring at it before riding toward Nelson's again. Each time something in his hand, a sliver of soap, a tin cup with a new leather handle, a piece of bacon wrapped in wax paper. Nothing heavy, nothing flashy, just things people needed if they were trying to remember how to be human again. And always, he placed them the same way, not close, not far, never looking directly at her, never asking anything in return. Sometimes she took them, sometimes not. Once he noticed the cornbread had been torn into careful quarters, crust set aside like someone used to making things last. Another time, the blanket was gone, and in its place was a bundle of straw woven tight, shaped into something like a bird's nest. Clay didn't touch it, just stood a little longer that morning, watched the way dust motes spun in the barn's shafts of light. He didn't speak to Nelson anymore, didn't trust the man, and had nothing left to ask. He wasn't here for a horse anymore, not really. He was here because there was a silence in that stall that felt familiar. Not comfortable, but known. He understood what it meant to survive inside silence, to carry it like a sack of rocks across every day until the weight became part of the walk. One afternoon, late in the week, Clay brought something different. Not food, not cloth. A mirror, small, metal-backed, scuffed from years of saddlebag travel. It had belonged to his wife once, back when she liked to braid her hair in the mornings and ask him if the wind would ruin it. He'd kept it in a drawer for years, took it out once, stared at his face, and put it back. He wasn't sure why he brought it now, but he set it on the ledge near her stall, face down, and then, for the first time, he sat. Properly, right. There on a hay bale, hands folded, elbows on knees, didn't talk, didn't shift, just sat. 15 minutes, maybe more. When he stood, she hadn't moved, but the mirror was gone. Back at the ranch, Clay didn't tell anyone, didn't have anyone to tell. The hired boy who came twice a week to mend fence and fetch feed didn't ask questions, and Clay wasn't a man who gave out words just to fill the air. He poured his coffee, fed the dog, saddled up like usual, but each day he brought something back from town or from his land, and each day he left it behind. It wasn't charity, it wasn't rescue, it was rhythm. And somewhere between the fourth and fifth visit, Clay stopped wondering what he was doing. He'd long quit asking himself why. The reasons weren't sharp anymore, just soft around the edges like worn leather or sun-bleached wood. She hadn't spoken, still hadn't touched him. But one morning, as he stepped into the barn with a tin of salve for her cracked hands, he saw something different. The blanket, his blanket, was folded, neatly, placed near the stall wall, and on top of it, carefully balanced, was the mirror, face up. That day when he left, he didn't bring anything. He just stood near the stall, dust on his boots, hands loose at his sides. "You don't have to say nothing," he said quietly. "But if you ever decide to stand up and walk out of here, you won't be alone." She didn't answer, but this time her head lifted, and though her eyes didn't meet his, they didn't avoid him either. He tipped his hat, left the barn, and this time he looked back, just once. Part 6, a Dry Creek Law and a Name on Paper. Clay Harlan wasn't a man who liked town much. Dry Willow had 2 dusty streets, a crooked sign that hadn't pointed north in years, and a sheriff's post that sat half-shadowed by the saloon wall, as if even the law needed something stronger than coffee most days. He rode slowly that morning, didn't tie up at the hitching rail outside the barber shop or general store. Instead, he swung down at the county office and walked in with the weight of silence stitched into every step. The clerk barely looked up from his ledger. "Morning, Harlan." Clay nodded. "Need a copy of the work registration law." The clerk's pen paused. "Something wrong with your ranch hands?" Clay said nothing, just waited. Eventually, the clerk handed over the paper, his fingers ink-stained and calloused from years of bookkeeping lives that didn't belong to him. Clay took the page, folded it twice, and stepped outside where the light was honest. He read it leaning against the rail post. All employed persons without formal identification must be registered under legal sponsorship. Failure to do so constitutes abandonment and is subject to state reclamation under bonded labor codes. In Dry Creek terms, that meant this: if you didn't have papers and no one put their name beside yours, you could be claimed like a mule, worked like one, and discarded just the same. Clay refolded the paper, didn't swear, didn't frown, just walked across the street to the sheriff's office, boots slow against sun-bleached boards. Sheriff Dunham was inside, chewing a matchstick and pretending not to nap. "Morning, Clay." "I need to sponsor a worker," Clay said. The sheriff blinked, leaned forward. "You hire someone new?" "No." "You got a name then?" "No." The matchstick moved from one side of Dunham's mouth to the other. "You're saying you want to put your name down beside someone who ain't got one?" Clay didn't answer, just took the form when it was offered and filled it out, line by line. When he reached the box marked worker's full name, he stared at it for a while, then wrote, "Unknown, female, approximately 19 to 25, found working unpaid on Nelson's property. In the sponsor's name field, he wrote, Clayton Harlan, Willow Ranch. He signed it with his usual slow curl of letters, deliberate as if each stroke carried weight. The sheriff leaned back. You know this'll be your responsibility if anything happens. Any harm she causes, any damage. Clay stood. Then it's mine. He folded the paper, tipped his hat, left before the sheriff could think of anything else to say. Outside, the wind had stilled. Dust hung in the air like it didn't know where to go. Clay tucked the folded document into his coat pocket and walked back to his horse. He didn't ride straight for Nelson's place. Instead, he detoured through the long arroyo that cut behind the schoolhouse, then followed the old cattle path down toward the edge of Dry Creek. The water was low, just a trickle through cracked stone, but enough to wet a boot if you weren't watching your step. He rode slow, didn't want to startle her. When he reached the barn, it was near sunset, the kind that paints everything gold, even the splintered fence posts and the dust between shadows. She wasn't in the stall. For one sharp moment he thought she was gone. Then he saw the blanket, folded again, this time with a small coil of thread resting on top. She'd patched the corner. The crooked star was whole again. He stood there, holding the folded paper in his coat pocket like it burned. Then he turned, walked outside, and waited. She came back not long after, barefoot, hands smudged with creek mud, holding a rusted pail half full of water. She paused when she saw him, didn't speak, didn't run. He didn't reach for her, didn't move closer, just said, quiet and steady, You're not a debt anymore, not his, not mine. Got it on paper. She stared at him, at the sky, at the barn behind him. Then, without a word, she walked past him, set the pail down by the trough, and wiped her hands on her skirt like it was any other evening. Clay didn't smile, didn't expect her to thank him, but he knew the look on her face. Barely there, quiet as dust lifting in morning light. It wasn't fear, not quite yet trust, but maybe the start of something that didn't need to hide anymore. Part 7. A Girl Gone and a Path Through Mesquite. It was 3 days before Clay came back. He hadn't planned on giving it time, but the rains came soft and steady for once, soaking the topsoil and drawing the wild onion up in pale green blades across the ridgelines. He had fencing down near the creek to mend, and one steer with a split hoof that needed soaking. He wasn't avoiding her, but he wasn't charging toward something either. That morning he brought a fresh loaf, baked that morning in town, still warm in a cloth, and 2 tin coffee cups, one chipped, one not. Just something to leave behind. But when he stepped into the barn, it was quiet in a different way, too still. The straw was neatly gathered in one corner, the blanket folded again but not left. Gone. The patch of ground where she'd slept for weeks had been swept clean, as if she'd never taken up space at all. But Clay noticed the water tin was missing. So was the small spoon he'd once tucked beside the cornbread, and near the back of the stall, a faint trail of flattened straw led out the rear door. He stepped outside, eyes scanning the dust. For a second, he just stood there, letting the wind tug at his collar. The kind of wind that didn't whistle or whip, just moved through things, soft but certain. And in that dust, barely visible beneath the crust of last night's storm, were tracks. Boot prints, small, light, steady. He didn't call her name, didn't run, just followed. They led down past the dry creek bed, where mesquite thorns bowed low and birds scattered at his steps. No horse, no mule, just those quiet boot prints weaving through the bramble, headed southeast, away from the road, away from town, toward a part of the valley few folks had reason to walk. After a while, he found her. She was sitting beneath a twisted mesquite, its branches curved like broken fingers reaching skyward. She had the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands gripped the empty water tin, and her head was resting against the bark like it might offer something back. She saw him coming, didn't startle, didn't rise, just looked. Not defensive, not ashamed, not even hopeful, just watching. Clay stopped a good 10 feet away, one hand resting on the saddle horn. He didn't speak for a while. Let the silence settle between them. There wasn't any wind down there, just the low creak of trees and the buzz of unseen flies above the brush. When he did speak, it was quiet, not accusing. "Didn't think you'd leave." "I didn't," she said. Her voice came like a splinter under skin, soft, slow, and not used much. "I just couldn't stay there anymore. That barn, it ain't mine." Clay nodded, didn't press. She shifted on the ground, fingers tightening around the tin. "Didn't want to owe you. You don't." She didn't look convinced. He took a step closer, just one, then paused. "You still got the paper?" She reached inside the blanket and pulled it out, creased and folded. It looked like she'd opened and closed it 100 times. He noticed one corner was torn, a spot where maybe she'd clutched it too hard. "Wasn't sure it was real," she said. "Thought maybe you'd take it back." Clay squatted down, his knees crackling like dry branches. He didn't get too close, just far enough for the next words to carry without echo. "I don't take back kindness," he said, "not when it's real." She blinked, slow, looked down at the dirt. Clay added, "I didn't do it to rescue you." "Why then?" He looked past her, to where the valley dipped into low brush and the horizon ran flat. "Because I've been stuck in places that didn't feel like mine either," he said. "Because I know what it's like to look at a door and not know if you're allowed to walk through it." They sat like that for a while. Just a man and a girl, neither of them strangers to silence. After a bit, she lifted the tin and sipped the last of what looked like creek water, then stood, slowly, wrapping the blanket tighter around her. She didn't ask what came next, just looked at him. And maybe, for the first time, Clay saw something else in her eyes, not trust, but maybe a choice. So he didn't tell her what to do, didn't hold out a hand. He just turned and started walking back, one step at a time. Behind him, he heard her footfalls begin to match his. Light, careful, but there, that was enough. Part 8, a place where even failures stay. The cabin sat crouched against the slope, half shadowed by cottonwoods and the stretch of ridge behind it. Clay had built it himself after the fire, working with timber that hadn't yet rotted, using hands that weren't quite ready for anything that resembled living. It wasn't much, just one room, lean-to roof, a porch with one rail broken, but it had held up longer than he thought it would. He didn't say anything when they got back, just stepped down from the saddle, led the horse around to the trough, and started uncinching the tack like it was any other day. No introductions, no instructions, just quiet work. Mara stood at the fence line a long while. Blanket still around her shoulders, she let her fingers trail the grain of the cedar rails, following the rise and dip of the wood like she was reading it. There was a question in the way she moved, but no words to ask it. She didn't head toward the house, not yet. Instead, she walked the fence line, then stopped by the low shed near the chicken coop, peered in, saw the rake and the hoe hung up, the feed sacks folded in the corner, everything in its place, but not pristine, just used and put back like someone who wasn't trying to impress anybody, only trying not to lose track of things. She stepped to the water trough, ran her hand across the surface, felt the cold. Clay didn't say a word, just watched. Some part of him knew that people who'd been treated like livestock needed more than a warm bed and a meal to feel human again. They needed space and a chance to choose. Eventually, she stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under her weight. She didn't flinch. She noticed the sag in the roofline. the way the chinking between the logs had been patched more than once. The chair beside the door was handmade, the seat woven tight from old leather strips and worn just at the edge. Beside it, a small table with a chipped tin cup turned upside down. And on the rail, a coil of rope, not lassoed, just set down like someone might use it again tomorrow. Clay opened the door. Inside was dim but clean. One bed, one table, two chairs, a stove in the corner, the pipe angling through the ceiling at a lean like a drunk man finding his balance. A single shelf with a few books, mostly worn paperbacks, one Bible and a Sears catalog from 5 years back. He didn't look at her, just said, "Supper's beans." Then walked to the stove and stirred the pot like he'd been doing it every night for 10 years. Mara didn't speak, but she stepped inside. Just 1 foot first. She didn't close the door behind her. Just let it hang open, letting the dusk in. When he handed her a bowl, she took it with both hands. Didn't sit right away, just stood by the window watching the wind move across the field. Then, finally, she took the second chair and sat across from him. They ate in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but wasn't quite familiar yet either. She didn't ask what kind of beans. He didn't tell her, but they were warm, salted, cooked through, enough to fill the belly. Afterward, she reached for the tin basin near the hearth, filled it with water from the pitcher, and began to wash the dishes. He didn't ask. She just did it. He stepped outside for a while, gave her the space. By the time he came back in, the bowl was dry, the tin cup righted and set beside it, and the blanket folded neatly at the edge of the bedroll, but her boots were sitting outside the door. That meant something. No one who planned on running in the middle of the night left their boots out. It was small, but Clay noticed. He didn't say a thing, just stoked the fire, took his seat again, and poured a second cup of coffee from the pot he'd set earlier. He didn't hand it to her, just set it on the table. She took it, held it in both hands. Didn't drink right away, just let the warmth bleed through her fingers. That night, long after the wind died and the coyotes started calling, Mara rolled herself in the blanket and lay near the hearth, back to the wall. Clay lay on his bedroll near the door. No words were traded, no stories told. But something unspoken lingered in the room, like the faint smell of cedar after rain. A beginning, not a rescue, not salvation, just a place where even folks who'd been broken might be allowed to sit still for a while. Part 9. A hidden name and a measure of dignity. The days slipped by in the kind of silence that didn't press, didn't question. Clay didn't ask what Mara could do. He just worked. And if she followed, she followed. If she didn't, he didn't take it personally. But she did. She followed. Mornings she swept the porch with an old straw broom before he even stepped outside. Midday she boiled coffee water without asking if he wanted some, just left it near the stove and walked out again. He noticed she never sat too long, didn't idle. When there wasn't a chore, she'd find one, straightening the feed sacks, wiping the window glass with the hem of her dress, even if it only smeared the dust. It was the kind of working Clay recognized, not for pride, not for order, but for distance. She moved like she was keeping herself just far enough from remembering something. Once he found his best flannel shirt, patched at the elbow, a careful, clean job. The stitch was small, tight, nothing fancy, but done with a sure hand. She never mentioned it. He wore it the next day. No word passed between them about that either. And when the hinges on the smokehouse started groaning, he came back one afternoon to find her on a stool, hammer in hand, wedge of leather already cut to soften the swing. Mara didn't smile when she saw him. But she didn't flinch either. That meant more. At night, she sat by the hearth while he read, or whittled. She never asked for a book, just watched the flames curl around the logs like they were dancing to some song only she remembered. Once, Clay reached for a scrap of cedar and handed it to her, along with the blade. She looked at it like it was some kind of test. Then, without a word, began carving, slow, shallow grooves. Not art, just motion. He didn't ask what she made. She didn't show him. That was fine. Some things didn't need explaining. But Clay knew a thing or two about shame. The way it curls around the ribs makes a person want to earn every breath. He'd worn it for years after his wife died, thinking he should have fixed what couldn't be fixed. Grief, when it hardens, turns into something a man carries in his bones. He saw it in Mara, too. One morning he found her scrubbing the inside of the water bucket, even though it didn't need it. Her hands were raw, red. He stepped outside. When he came back, he set something on the stoop. A small cloth bundle wrapped in oilskin, tied with twine. He didn't say a word, just left it and walked off to check the north fence. It took her near an hour before she stepped out to look. Inside was a silver coin. Real silver, not a new one, but polished with care. It sat on top of another scrap of cloth, one of his old handkerchiefs folded neat. Pinned to it, a note, just 3 words, written in his plain hand. For your time. That evening she didn't cook. He did. He ladled out stew and set 2 spoons on the table. When she sat, she didn't look at him, but she didn't keep her head down like before. They ate in quiet. Then, halfway through her bowl, she stopped, let her spoon rest in the stew. Her voice, when it came, was so soft it barely crept past the sound of wind tapping on the window. My name's Mara. She didn't look at him, just kept her eyes on the spoon. Mama gave it to me, said it meant bitterness turned sweet. I didn't use it for a long time. Didn't feel like mine anymore. Clay didn't say anything right away, just took a slow drink of water, set the cup down, and nodded. Reckon you've earned it back. She looked up then, not smiling, not crying, just there, really there, like her voice had dragged the rest of her back into the room. He stood, went to the mantel, and brought down a flat piece of scrap wood, set it in front of her. If you want, carve it, put it where you can see it. Then handed her the knife. She took it, held it like it might disappear, then traced the grain with her thumb. She didn't carve it right away, but later that night, after Clay had gone out to the shed, she set to work. By morning the sign leaned quietly against the hearth. Just one word, Mara, no flourish, no date. But it sat steady, and that was enough. Part 10, the gate she opened herself. They didn't talk about the name carved into the scrap wood, but Clay left it there by the hearth, propped steady between a bootjack and the stone wall. It stayed even when the wind whistled through the gaps, even when the fire had burned down to ash. In the days that followed, Mara took to walking farther, not far enough to leave, but far enough to touch the fence line with her own hands, to follow the outer pasture and press her palm against the wooden gate where it met the post. She moved with care, not as if afraid anymore, but like someone testing how far her feet were allowed to go before the world pulled back. Clay noticed it without comment. That was how things worked between them. He didn't fill silences with questions, and she didn't offer answers before they were ready. One morning, he stood on the porch drinking coffee, watching a hawk rise slow over the ridge. Mara stepped out beside him, her hands rubbed raw from mending the chicken pen. She nodded once at the sky, then said, I want to sign the papers myself. Clay didn't ask what papers. He just set his coffee down and said, We'll ride into county on Friday. Office opens after the morning mail. That Friday, the wind was low. The clouds stretched like linen across the sky. Clay saddled the sorrel and didn't say much, as Mara cinched her own saddlebag, tied it tight with a piece of twine. She wore a plain calico dress, mended in 2 places, but clean. Her boots were dusted from walking fence lines, but she didn't seem to mind. They rode slow. It wasn't a trip about haste. When they reached the county office, Clay tied off the horses and stood back as Mara stepped inside first. Her fingers touched the frame of the doorway for a breath. Then she crossed into the building like a woman walking into her own life, not someone else's offer. The clerk barely looked up. Name? Mara hesitated, only a blink. Then, Mara Tillman. The name passed her lips steady without apology. The man wrote it down, pulled a ledger close. Mark here. Clay stood behind her quiet, far enough not to crowd, close enough in case she needed his stillness. She picked up the pen like it was something that might bite, then scrawled her name with a slow, careful hand. Not beautiful, but legible. Not quick, but firm. The ink bled a little at the edge of the paper. She didn't blot it. She didn't need to. Outside, she handed Clay the folded form. He took it without unfolding, tucked it into his coat like it was something private and final. They didn't speak again until they reached the edge of the pasture. The sun was coming down behind the ridge, turning the dry brush gold. The fence gate stood ahead, open just a crack. Mara pulled her horse to a stop, dismounted, and walked forward on foot. She reached the gate latch and opened it herself. Clay stayed back, watched her lead her horse through without waiting for him. She didn't look back. She didn't need to ask permission. When she reached the cabin, she set her saddlebag on the porch, knocked the dust from her skirt, and opened the front door without pause. Inside, the sign still leaned against the hearth. M-A-R-A. Letters plain, edges dark from smoke. She straightened it, just a little, then turned and waited for Clay at the threshold, not as someone being let in, but someone who had chosen to stay. When he arrived, she didn't speak, just opened the door wider so he could follow her in. That night he made coffee without asking. She served the bread. No thanks were exchanged. Only a quiet knowing, stretched between them like the warm wood of the table. Outside, the gate swung in the breeze, unlatched, unafraid. Part 11. Mistletoe above the stove, and a name carved in wood. Winter came without warning that year. One morning the air shifted. It wasn't the cold itself, but how it wrapped around the corners of the cabin like it meant to stay. The sky grew low, ash-colored. The chickens grew quiet. Even the wind moved slower, as if giving up on protest. Clay stacked wood higher than usual by the porch. He didn't say anything about the storm tracks shifting west. He just kept bringing in armfuls of split oak and dry mesquite. Mara swept the hearth each evening, even when there was no ash to chase. They fell into patterns. That's how the West kept people alive, patterns that didn't need permission. One evening, as Clay lit the first fire of the hard freeze, Mara walked out toward the edge of the fence line. She took with her a small tin pail, empty, save for a bit of twine and her pocket knife. She returned 20 minutes later with a dry sprig of mistletoe, shriveled white berries clinging stubbornly to its stem. She didn't say where she'd found it, just climbed the small ladder and pinned it above the stove. Not for kisses. That wasn't her way. It was more like proof. Proof someone was still living here, still making choices. When Clay noticed it, he didn't speak. He just poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table near her chair. Out of habit now, not charity. Mara had begun leaving her boots by the door, even when there wasn't mud on them. Her coat stayed on the peg inside, not out. She swept the porch without being asked. Clay fixed the rattle in the barn door hinge without being told. Somehow, between firelight and worn routines, They'd built a kind of home around what neither could say out loud. Mara took up mending quietly, first her own hemline, then a torn sleeve on Clay's Sunday shirt. One afternoon she found an old drawer filled with scrap cloth, buttons that didn't match anything, and a bit of dried thread Clay's wife had stored long ago. She didn't ask whose it was. She just used what was there. By the time the first real snow brushed the eaves, Mara had taken to humming while she worked. Nothing loud, nothing with words. But some mornings Clay could hear a bit of tune trailing from the back stoop, notes soft enough to be mistaken for wind, unless you knew to listen. That week he passed her a gift wrapped in oilcloth, his whittling knife, the one he'd kept tucked behind the spice rack for years. Bone handle worn smooth, blade still sharp from constant care. He didn't explain it, didn't need to. Mara held it like it was something sacred, not because it was valuable, but because someone had decided she was trusted with it. Later that evening, after the fire had dimmed and Clay had turned in, she knelt by the cabin's front doorpost with a stub of candle beside her and that same knife in hand. She carved, slow, careful, not artful, but true. Mara, grass season, 1884. She didn't sign it like a message. It wasn't meant to be seen. The next coat of dust or soot would fade it down to almost nothing, but she knew it was there, and that was enough. The next morning, Clay saw it when he stepped outside with the coffee pot. He didn't touch it, didn't comment. He just reached up, adjusted the mistletoe ever so slightly, and added another log to the fire. No smiles, no ceremony, but that evening Mara left the door unlatched until Clay came in behind her. That was her way of saying, I carved my name here, and I'm not leaving, not hiding, not anymore. Part 12, A Man Who Came for Her, and a Paper That Held. The snow had started to melt, not fully, just enough to make the steps slick and the earth soft around the hooves. Clay had been sanding a new yoke in the barn when he heard the dog give a half-hearted bark and then quiet again. Something about that silence made him straighten. Out the window, a horse stood tethered loose at the hitchpost. A man leaned against the rail, hat low, boots sharp-toed and polished where the rest of him was not. His coat was expensive but worn too long. His belt buckle gleamed, but the hands that rested on his hips had grime pressed deep into the creases. Mara saw him through the same pane of glass. She didn't flinch. She didn't hide either. Instead, she dried her hands on her apron, walked to the cupboard, and set down the cornbread she'd just pulled from the oven. Clay stepped to the door before the man had a chance to knock. "Morning," the man said, eyes raking over the porch, the dust line, the carved name near the frame. "Heard tell a girl I had claim on might have come through here. Pretty thing. Black hair, name she don't use." Clay leaned against the jamb. "A lot of folks pass through." "She owes me," the man said. Not angry, just certain. "Ran off while still under debt contract. I paid good coin. She's mine till the papers say otherwise." Clay didn't raise his voice, didn't step aside. He just pulled from his pocket a folded slip of parchment. The county seal waxed clean on the bottom, her signature crooked and careful above it. He held it up like it was nothing more than a grocery list. "She's sponsored," Clay said. "As of 3 months past. Papers on file in town. Sheriff's seen it. Judge, too." The man's face tightened. "Thought you'd be smarter than that," he said low. "Taking in trouble like her. She's got a way of acting grateful while planning how to vanish." Clay let the paper fall back into his coat. "She stays because she chooses to." The man spat sideways, missed the step, and cursed. "You think you get the good part," he muttered, already turning toward the horse. "But folks like her, they're stitched with fault lines. Give it time. She'll split." Clay didn't answer. He didn't need to. When the man rode off, coat flaring like he still believed in swagger, Mara stepped out. From the kitchen. She hadn't moved from behind the stove during any of it, but now her feet touched the porch like they belonged there. In her hand was a short length of rope, frayed, dirt embedded, the kind they use to hobble ankles, not livestock. She didn't explain, didn't need to. Clay stepped back and let her pass. She walked slow to the peach tree out back, dug with her bare hands into the soft earth beneath where the first buds had just started to shiver open. She buried the rope without ceremony, covered it with a flat stone. Then she sat on the porch steps for a long while after, cup of water in hand, watching the wind pull the clouds apart overhead. That night they ate in silence, like usual, pinto beans. The same cornbread she'd set down earlier, but something in her posture had changed. Not lightened, but steadied, like someone who had seen the storm, felt the wind turn bitter, and still decided not to bolt. Later, she tucked the county paper into a small box beside the hearth. Not locked, not hidden, just placed, careful and deliberate, among a folded shirt, 2 photographs, and the whittling knife Clay had once given her. The next morning she stirred the fire with bare hands, no hesitation, and set the coffee to percolate before he'd even risen. Clay stepped into the room, nodded once. "You all right?" She didn't answer right away, just poured 2 cups, one dark, one darker. "I stayed," she said at last. "That's all I need to say." And Clay, watching her from the shadow of the doorframe, understood, because in a land where folks either vanish or get taken, staying was the bravest damn thing a person could do. Part 13. Folks who don't ask, just set an extra chair. Spring in Dry Willow always came in pieces. First the mud, then the wind softened, just enough to carry the scent of sage and wet timber. It wasn't a place for grand arrivals. Things settled here in hushes and shared glances across church pews and porch rails. That's how it happened with Mara. No announcements, no declarations, just presence. At first she kept close to the ranch, tending chickens, sewing linings into Clay's old work jackets, trying to get ahead of a roof leak that always came with thaw. She kept busy, but not out of fear anymore. There was something else in the way she moved, like each task was a stone in a path she was finally laying for herself. Clay didn't push, never did, but he noticed things, like how she brushed her hair now, tying it back with a strip of faded red calico, or how she left the cabin door open on warmer afternoons, letting the sound of the windmill turn slow and steady into the rooms. Then came the first time she asked to go into town, just that, "Can I ride in with you?" She didn't say why, didn't need to. He nodded, hitched the wagon. It was a Saturday, and the main road near the general store still carried more gossip than freight. Folks looked, that was expected, but no one said a word, at least not to her face. May Larkin, the widow who ran the bakery, saw them come in and didn't blink. She just took one look at Myra's hands, the way they were wrapped but rough, and slid a fresh heel of sourdough across the counter. "Looks like you work," she said. "That earns bread in this town." Mara didn't reply, but she left a coin and nodded her thanks. That was the first door. The next came a week later when Clay brought in a load of seed, and Mara stayed back to tie the sacks. A small girl wandered up, barefoot, wild-haired, too young to know shame. She stared at Mara like kids do when they're still honest. Then she handed her a tied bundle of sage, crushed but fragrant. "You smell like Mama," the girl said, then ran off before Mara could answer. That night the sage hung above their stove, and something else hung in the space between them, an invisible thread pulling tighter. Soon Mara started trading, cornbread wrapped in cloth, stitched repairs on sleeves too worn for their age. She didn't ask prices, just left a small note with each parcel. No debt. Just work. Folks didn't argue. They simply started leaving a second chair out whenever Clay came through. One at the church socials, one at Doc Pruitt's waiting porch, one behind the mercantile next to the crate of cracked eggs she'd taken to sorting once a week. They didn't call her Clay's girl. They didn't call her anything at all. Just let her sit. Sometimes that's the only welcome a body needs. And Mara, she never smiled wide, never laughed loud, but there was a way her shoulders sat differently now. Not pulled in tight, not ducking under memory, but level, even proud. One late afternoon, a boy with a chipped fiddle started playing at the square. No one asked him to. He just did. Folks threw coins, some danced, and there, half in shade, half in the spill of lantern light, Mara stood with a plate of sliced apples, watching, not stepping forward but not stepping back either. Clay saw her from across the hitch post. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just watched her be there, in the middle of things, without shrinking. That night, back at the cabin, she placed one of the coins she'd earned, silver, clean, unbent, on the mantel beside the county document and her old rope-torn shoes. A strange kind of shrine, not to survival, but to staying, because maybe the West wasn't about outrunning what had come before. Maybe, for some folks, the real grit was in staying put, showing up, making cornbread and saying no to shame. And in Dry Willow, they didn't need your past, just your presence. Part 14. Nobody's a stranger who chooses to stay. Rain came that morning, not hard, not loud, just a slow tapping on the porch roof like someone knocking without urgency. It was the kind of rain that made a man breathe easier, not because he needed it, but because he'd nearly forgotten what the land looked like, with its shoulders down. Clay Harlan stood under the awning, coffee in hand, thumb brushing the chipped rim of the tin cup he always used. The steam rose soft, carrying the smell of bitter grounds and something older, comfort maybe. He watched as the drops softened the dust, traced lines down the gate, pooled in shallow hoofprints from the night before. Beside him, nailed fresh to the crossbeam of the gate, a wooden sign swung gently in the breeze. Willow Ranch. Owners Clay Harlan, NMT. No one had asked what the letters meant. No one needed to. Mara hadn't asked either. She saw it the day before when she came back from town, arms full of cloth scraps and one bar of soap. She didn't quite need, but bought anyway. She'd stood there, eyes on the sign, lips parted like a word had almost made it out. But it hadn't, didn't need to. That night she'd made stew, onions, beans, bits of rabbit, nothing fancy but warm all the way down. She poured a bowl for him, placed a slice of bread beside it, and sat across the table without her usual space between. She didn't say thanks. He didn't ask for any. There was no toast, no clink of tin cups, no ceremony, just supper and the kind of silence that made a man feel seen, not ignored. Mara had changed, though you had to be paying attention to see it. She wore her hair tied back now with purpose, not shame. She walked with her palms open instead of curled into fists. She didn't shrink from light. And sometimes, if the wind was right, she even hummed. Not songs with words, just sounds, like remembering what a voice was for. That evening, she pulled a chair closer to the fire. Not to speak, not to read, just to be near. And Clay, well, he didn't say anything either, but he shifted in his seat just enough that their knees brushed when he reached for his cup. She didn't pull away. Outside, the last of the rain tapped out its goodbye, and in the hush that followed, Mara rose, walked to the mantel, and placed the sage bundle, now dried and faded, into a small clay bowl above the hearth. She looked at it a moment, then turned back. "You know what the T stands for?" she asked, voice low, unsure if it needed answering. Clay looked up, eyes meeting hers steady and warm. He didn't smile, not really, but there was something close in the lines around his mouth. "Maybe tomorrow," he said, and she nodded. Because not everything needs naming right away. Some things, like belonging, like trust, grow best when left quiet a little longer. That night, Mara added a third tin cup to the shelf. Not for her, not for him, just in case. Because sometimes, when you stop hiding, you start hoping. And on that stretch of earth out past Dry Willow, where the wind carried secrets and the sky never hurried, hope had started to feel like home. Out here, where fences wear the years and silence carries more than words ever could, not every story ends with a wedding or a gunshot. Some just settle, like dust after a storm, like two chairs at the same table, no longer empty. She didn't owe him anything, and he never asked. But between tin mugs and quiet dinners, between mended fences and names carved in wood, something old, healed, not loud, not fast, but enough. And in the West, sometimes enough is everything. If stories like this make you pause, just for a moment, then leave a word down below, like share or subscribe if you feel it. Not for numbers, but so the trail stays warm and stories like this keep finding the folks who need them.